My name is Mark Halverson, and 30 minutes after my stepson whispered one sentence into the backseat of my car, the police were standing on his father's front porch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't throw a punch. I just stayed calm, and somehow that made everything fall apart. It started on a Sunday evening in Sioux City, Iowa, the kind of gray early fall day where the wind cuts through your jacket no matter how thick it is. I remember checking the dashboard clock as I turned onto Gordon Drive, 6:12 p.m., right on time. I've always been right on time. That's how I was raised. You show up when you say you will, especially when a kid is involved. I was there to pick up my wife's son, Evan, for our scheduled visitation. Evan was 11 then, quiet, polite, the kind of kid who says yes, sir, without being told. He wasn't my biological son, but I'd been married to his mother, Linda, for 7 years. Long enough that he felt like mine in every way that mattered. I parked in front of Rick Dawson's house, his father. Same place as always. Small, split-level, peeling white paint, overgrown hedges Rick never trimmed. The porch light flickered like it always did. I remember thinking I should tell him to replace that bulb. Funny what sticks in your head before everything changes. Rick opened the door before I even knocked. That's when I saw it. A bruise under Evan's left eye. Not fresh red, not bleeding. That sick yellow-purple color that tells you it's been there a few days. Long enough to settle in. Evan stood just behind Rick's backpack, hanging off one shoulder, eyes glued to the floor. "What happened to your face?" I asked before I could stop myself. Rick didn't even look back at him. He just crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, like this was a casual conversation between men. "He needed to learn respect," Rick said. He said it calmly, almost proudly. Behind him, his wife, Tracy, Evan's stepmother, let out a little laugh. Not loud. Just enough to let me know she found it amusing. "Boys' roughhouse," she said. "You know how it is." I didn't actually. I grew up with 2 brothers and a father who worked construction his whole life. We roughhoused plenty, but no one ever left a bruise on my face and called it discipline. I looked back at Evan. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there small and quiet like he was trying to disappear. Rick tilted his head at me, smirked. "You're too soft on him, Mark," he said. "That's why he talks back. Kid needs to know who's in charge." There it was, the word again. Respect. He said it like it was a weapon. I felt something rise up in my chest, hot and sharp, but I swallowed it down. Yelling wouldn't help Evan. Arguing on the porch wouldn't help him either. All it would do is give Rick exactly what he wanted. So I nodded. "Let's go, buddy," I said to Evan, keeping my voice even. Rick stepped aside. Tracy smiled wider like she'd won something. Evan walked past them and down the steps. I followed him to the car. The air felt heavier than it had a minute ago. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose leaves along the curb. We got in. I buckled Evan's seatbelt myself like I always did. My hands were steady even though my heart wasn't. I pulled away from the curb and turned down the street. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror. The car was quiet. No radio, no talking. Just the click-click of the turn signal and the low hum of the engine. We drove for almost a full minute like that. Then Evan spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. He said, "If I told anyone," Evan said, staring straight ahead, "it would be worse next time." My foot eased off the gas without me thinking about it. The car slowed. "What did you say?" I asked. He swallowed. I could see his throat move. He said if I told you Evan continued, or Mom, or a teacher, he'd make sure it didn't show next time. I felt cold all at once. Not angry. Terrified. Because I knew what that meant. I'd seen that look before years ago in a coworker who used to come in with long sleeves in July. In a neighbor kid who stopped coming around after dark. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't boys being boys. This was a pattern. I pulled into the parking lot of a Casey's on the corner and put the car in park. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A man walked past with a coffee cup and didn't look twice at us. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. "Evan," I said quietly, "you didn't do anything wrong." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't really believe it yet. I took a breath, long and slow. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. I drove home from that Casey's slower than usual, like every mile marker mattered. Evan sat quiet in the passenger seat, hands folded in his lap, eyes tracking the empty field slipping past the window. The sun was dropping low, throwing long shadows across the road. I kept thinking how ordinary it all looked and how wrong that felt. When we pulled into our driveway, Linda was already waiting by the front door. She must have been watching for us. She always did on exchange nights. I cut the engine and sat there a second longer than necessary, steadying my breath. Linda opened the door before Evan even reached the steps. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "How was?" She stopped when she saw his face. The smile vanished. "What happened to your eye?" she asked. Evan shrugged. The same shrug I'd seen kids use 100 times when they didn't think the truth was safe. I stepped in gently, let him put his bag down first. Inside the house smelled like the pot roast Linda had started earlier. Normal, comfortable. It made my chest tighten. Evan headed down the hall to his room and I followed Linda into the kitchen. She turned to me, eyes wide. "Mark, what is that?" "A bruise," I said, "and it's not from roughhousing." She opened her mouth and closed it again, sat down at the table like her legs had given out. I lowered my voice. "He told me Rick said it'd be worse if he talked." Linda pressed her lips together. For a moment I thought she might argue, defend him, make excuses. Instead she whispered, "Oh God." I asked Evan if I could take a look just to make sure he was okay. He nodded, rolled up his sleeve when I asked. That's when I saw the faint yellow marks on his upper arm, old enough to fade, new enough to matter. Linda covered her mouth with her hand. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear, Mark, I didn't know." I believed her, but belief didn't fix anything. I told Evan to go wash up and get into his pajamas. He hesitated, then did it. When he was out of earshot, I pulled my phone from my pocket. "I'm calling it in," I said. Linda's eyes flicked up. "Calling who?" "Non-emergency," I said. "The police?" Her shoulders stiffened. Are you sure this is the right?" I looked at her, not angry, just steady. "If not now," I said, "then when?" She didn't answer. I stepped onto the back porch so Evan wouldn't hear. The air was colder now. I could smell leaves and something metallic like rain was coming. The line rang twice before a woman answered. "Sioux City Police, non-emergency," she said. "How can I help you?" I explained, slowly, clearly, Evan's age, the bruise, what he said, where it happened. There was a pause on the other end. "Sir," she said, "are you sure this isn't a custody dispute?" There it was. I swallowed. "I'm sure," I said. "This isn't about custody. This is about a kid who's scared to talk." Another pause, keys tapping. "We do get a lot of calls like this," she said carefully. "I understand," I said. My voice shook and I hated that it did. But I wouldn't be calling if I didn't believe my stepson was in danger. She asked for addresses, names, dates. I gave her everything. When she said an officer would do a welfare check, my chest loosened just a little. "Thank you," I said and meant it. I went back inside. Linda was sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. "They're going to check on him," I said. She nodded. "Rick's going to be furious." "That's not my concern," I said. Evan came back in pajamas on hair still damp. I told him to sit with us. We watched an old rerun on TV, something safe and familiar. I laughed at the right moments. Evan leaned against his mother. From the outside, we probably looked like any other family winding down a Sunday night. My phone buzzed once, a text from Rick. "Tell your husband to stay in his lane." I didn't respond. 30 minutes passed. Then another 30. Across town, I knew what was happening before I ever saw it. Rick's porch light, the knock, the door opening, the surprise that flickered across his face when the uniforms came into view. I pictured Tracy standing behind him, smile gone. When my phone rang, it was an unknown number. "Mr. Halverson," a man asked. "This is Officer Keller with Sioux City PD." "Yes," I said. "We conducted the welfare check," he said. "We're filing a report and making a referral." I closed my eyes. "Thank you." There was a brief hesitation. "We'll be following up," he added. After I hung up, Linda reached for my hand. This time she didn't pull away. I looked down the hallway toward Evan's room. The light under his door was on. Rick had said this was about respect. Standing there listening to my own heartbeat slow, I understood something clearly for the first time. Respect wasn't about control. It was about protection. And this was only the beginning. For the first 2 days after the welfare check, nothing happened. No calls, no follow-up, no knock on our door. That silence messed with my head more than shouting ever could. I went to work like normal, same route, same parking spot behind the maintenance building at St. Luke's Hospital, same nods from the guys I'd worked with for years. I fixed a flickering ballast in the west wing, replaced a leaky valve near radiology, drank bad coffee from the break room. Ordinary things. Steady things. Inside, I was anything but steady. Evan stayed home from school that Monday. Linda called him in sick. He sat at the kitchen table coloring while I worked from my laptop, glancing up every few minutes, like he needed to make sure I was still there. Each time our eyes met, I nodded. He nodded back. That night, Linda's phone rang. She listened. Didn't say much. When she hung up, she stared at the wall for a long moment. My mom, she said. Rick called her. I waited. He told her, you're trying to take Evan away, she went on. That you're exaggerating things. That you've always wanted to replace him. I felt the old anger creep back in, slow and hot, and she believed him. Linda didn't answer right away. Then quietly, she wants us to slow down before we ruin things. That was when my phone buzzed. A text from Rick. See, nothing's gonna happen. Another message followed before I could respond. You should have taught him respect instead of calling the cops. I showed Linda the screen. Her face went pale. Don't answer him, she said. I wasn't planning to, I replied. But the words stuck with me all night. The next morning, I got a call from a woman at Child Protective Services. Her tone was polite, professional, careful. At this time, she said, we don't have enough information to take immediate action. Immediate action. Those words landed like a door quietly closing. She talked about procedures, about timelines, about how these things take time. I listened, took notes, thanked her. After I hung up, I sat in my truck for a full 10 minutes without starting the engine. I could hear Rick's laugh in my head. That afternoon, I stopped at the Hy-Vee on my way home. Just needed milk and bread. While I was checking out, a guy from our old church, someone I'd known for years, gave me a look that lingered a little too long. Everything okay, Mark? He asked. Fine, I said. He hesitated. Heard things can get complicated with blended families. I nodded, paid, and walked out with my bag cutting into my hand. That night, Evan barely ate. When Linda raised her voice just a little, calling him to the table, he flinched. That did it. The next morning, the school counselor called. She'd noticed Evan withdrawing, avoiding eye contact, jumping at sudden noises. She asked gently if anything was going on at home. I told her the truth. She listened, asked questions, took notes. I'm glad you spoke up, she said before hanging up. We'll document this. For the first time in days, I felt something shift. Rick didn't know that yet. He called that evening voice loud and cheerful, like we were old buddies. Told you, he said, all that drama for nothing. I let him talk, let him think he'd won. Because sometimes the worst thing you can do to a man like Rick Dawson is let him get comfortable. By the time the custody hearing notice arrived in the mail, I'd stopped expecting good news to come quickly. The envelope was plain white court seal in the corner. Woodbury County. I stood at the kitchen counter staring at it while the coffee maker hissed and sputtered. Linda watched me from the table, fingers wrapped tight around her mug. Well, she asked. I slid the paper across to her. She read it, then looked up, eyes wet but steady. So this is really happening, she said. It already was, I replied. Now it's just official. That afternoon, I took a half day off work and drove down to a small law office on Pierce Street, the kind of place with faded carpet and framed certificates that had been hanging there longer than I'd been married. The attorney's name was Gary Feldman, late 50s, gray hair, no nonsense. A guy from my VFW post had given me his card and said, if you want someone who won't grandstand, call Gary. Gary listened without interrupting. Didn't nod too much. Didn't rush me. Just let me talk. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. You did the right thing calling it in, he said. But you need to understand something. Cases like this don't turn on one bruise. They turn on patterns. That's what I'm afraid of, I said. He nodded. Good. Fear keeps people careful. Gary filed requests that same day, police records, prior complaints, anything tied to Rick Dawson's name. He warned me it might come back clean. Sometimes, he said, the worst people leave no paper trail. The waiting started again. Rick didn't wait. He showed up at Linda's work parking lot 2 days later, just standing there when she walked out, arms crossed, smiling like he owned the place. You're really doing this, he asked her. She told me later her voice shook when she said, "I'm protecting my son." Rick laughed. From what discipline? That night, Evan woke up from a nightmare. I sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing slowed. He didn't ask questions, just wanted me there. 3 days after that, Gary called. "Mark," he said, "I need you to come in." His tone wasn't excited or grim, just serious. I drove straight over. He slid a folder across the desk. Thinner than I expected, but heavy. "Rick Dawson had a domestic disturbance call 8 years ago," Gary said. "Different woman, not Evan's mother. She withdrew her statement 2 days later." My stomach dropped. "No charges," he continued, "but the officer's notes mention intimidation, threats, same language. Teaching respect." I closed my eyes. "There's more," Gary added. "Workplace write-up, anger issues, not criminal, but it shows a pattern." I rubbed my hands together slow. "So what does this mean?" "It means Rick isn't a one-time problem," Gary said. "It means the court will listen." As if that wasn't enough, something else surfaced the next day. Our next-door neighbor, Tom Wilkins, knocked on the door that evening. He was holding his phone, looking uncomfortable. "I don't want to get involved," he said, "but my doorbell camera caught something last month." He showed me the clip. "Rick, Evan," raised voice. A hard yank of the arm as Evan tried to pull away. No punch, no clear strike. But Evan flinched. That was all it took. I handed the phone back without saying a word. That night I sat alone in the garage staring at the concrete floor. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined when I first picked up the phone. It felt heavy, permanent. Linda sat down beside me. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked. I thought of Evan's whisper, the bruise, the silence. "Yes," I said, "even if it costs us." Gary's voice echoed in my head from earlier that day. "If we bring this to court," he'd said, "there's no going back." I was finally ready to say yes. The morning of the hearing, Sioux City felt smaller than it ever had. The sky was low and gray, the kind that presses down on you. I parked 2 blocks from the Woodbury County Courthouse and walked the rest of the way, hands in my coat pockets, breath fogging in front of me. Linda walked beside me, quiet her shoulder, brushing mine with each step. Evan stayed home with a friend's mom. Gary had said it was better that way. The courthouse doors opened with a hollow echo. Inside, everything smelled like old paper and disinfectant. We passed through the metal detector, shoes off, belt in a plastic tray. Ordinary procedures that felt heavy with meaning that day. Rick was already there. He stood near the wall outside the courtroom, arms crossed, laughing with Tracy like this was a lunch meeting that ran a little long. When he saw us, his smile sharpened. "Morning," he said loud enough for people to hear. "Hope you're ready to explain yourselves." I didn't answer. Gary touched my elbow and guided me to the bench. "Let him talk," he whispered. "People who talk too much do half the work for us." The courtroom filled slowly. A few other families sat scattered around, each one carrying their own quiet disasters. When the judge entered, everyone stood. She was a woman in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back, tight glasses low on her nose. She looked like someone who'd seen enough to be unimpressed by theatrics. "Be seated," she said. Rick's confidence didn't waver when the proceedings began. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, nodding along as if this were all a formality. Tracy sat beside him, hands folded, eyes wide and innocent. Gary stood when it was our turn. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pace. He just laid things out. Dates, times, statements. The bruise, the whisper, the welfare check. Rick shifted once, then settled again. When the school counselor's written statement was read, Rick scoffed under his breath. When the prior domestic report came up, he leaned forward. That was nothing, he said. Charges were dropped. The judge raised a hand. "You'll have your chance to speak, Mr. Dawson." Rick nodded, but his jaw was tight now. Then came the video. It played without sound at first, Rick on the screen, Evan pulling back, Rick's hand clamping down on his arm, Evan flinching. Rick shot to his feet. "That's not how it happened," he barked. "You can't just show." "Sit down," the judge said sharply. "One more interruption and you'll be held in contempt." Rick sat face red, breathing hard. The recorded statement was next. Evan's voice filled the room, thin but steady. He said if I told anyone it would be worse next time. I stared at the table in front of me while it played. I didn't trust myself to look anywhere else. When it ended, the courtroom was quiet. No shuffling, no coughing. Rick stood again this time when it was his turn. I'm his father, he said, voice rising. I have a right to discipline my son. Kids today don't know respect. Someone has to teach it to them. He looked straight at the judge like he expected agreement. Instead, she leaned forward. Mr. Dawson, she said, discipline is not fear. Rick scoffed. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, she cut in. This court protects children, not pride. That was it. Rick opened his mouth again, then closed it. Tracy's smile finally disappeared. The ruling came down clean and firm. Temporary suspension of unsupervised visitation. Mandatory anger management. No contact with the school without approval. Rick slumped back into his chair like the air had gone out of him. In the hallway afterward, he brushed past me, eyes hard. This isn't over, he muttered. I watched him walk away, his shoulders hunched, now his confidence gone. For the first time since that Sunday night, I felt my breath come all the way back into my chest. For about a week after the hearing, I thought the worst was behind us. That's what I told myself anyway. Life didn't snap back to normal. It inched there, one cautious step at a time. Evan came home from school lighter somehow, like he wasn't carrying the same weight in his backpack anymore. He slept through the night. He laughed real laughs, not the polite ones kids use when they're checking to see if it's safe. Linda watched him the way a person watches the horizon after a storm, half expecting another one to roll in. I went back to work full-time, replaced ceiling tiles, fixed a stubborn boiler valve, nodded at coworkers who didn't ask questions, but clearly had them. In a town like Sioux City, news doesn't spread fast. It just spreads everywhere. The bills started arriving a few days later. Legal fees, filing costs, missed hours at work. Nothing outrageous on its own, but together they stacked up like bricks on my chest. Linda offered to dip into her savings. I told her no. This was my call, my responsibility. Rick didn't take the ruling quietly. He never contacted Evan directly, that would have landed him in deeper trouble, but he circled around the edges. A text to Linda that read, "You're destroying our son's relationship with his father." A voicemail left on my phone late one night, heavy breathing, and a single sentence. This ends when I say it does. Gary told me to save everything. Don't respond. Let the paper trail grow. That was harder than it sounded. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table, phone in my hand, typing replies I never sent. Angry replies, righteous ones. Replies that would have felt good for about 10 seconds and cost us months. I deleted them all. Linda struggled too. She carried guilt like a second coat. Guilt for not seeing it sooner. Guilt for marrying Rick in the first place. Guilt for every moment Evan had spent under his roof while she told herself things were probably fine. One night she broke down at the sink, shoulders shaking while the water ran. I should have protected him better, she said. I stood behind her and rested my hands on her arms. You're doing it now, I said. That counts. It didn't fix everything, but it mattered. A month after the hearing, I ran into an old acquaintance at the VFW fish fry, someone who'd known Rick back when they both still wore their high school jackets, like they meant something. Didn't hear this from me, he said quietly, but Rick's not doing so great. I didn't ask for details. He gave them anyway. Rick's job had put him on leave after the court order surfaced during a background review tied to a promotion. Nothing official, nothing dramatic. Just enough scrutiny to make people uncomfortable. He'd moved out of his place and back in with his mother in a smaller town west of us. Tracy hadn't gone with him. I felt no joy hearing that. Only relief. Evan didn't know any of it, and that was the point. One evening I found him in the backyard tossing a baseball against the fence. He kept missing the catch, chasing it down, throwing again. I grabbed my glove and joined him. Want a hand, I asked. He nodded. We threw in silence for a while. The sky was turning pink at the edges. Crickets starting up in the grass. Mark, he said finally. Yeah, buddy. You didn't get mad, he said. Back then, in the car. I waited. You didn't yell, he went on. You just listened. I swallowed. I was mad, I said. I just didn't want to scare you. He thought about that, then nodded like it made sense. After dinner that night, as I was turning off the living room lights, Evan looked up at me. Night, Dad, he said. Then his eyes went wide. I mean, it's okay, I said quickly. You don't have to. But he smiled, a small one. Brave, I wanted to. I stood there after he went to bed, lights off, house quiet, feeling the full weight of what it had cost us and what it had given back. Doing the right thing hadn't been clean or easy or painless, but it had been worth it. It's strange how quiet life gets when the shouting finally stops. Not empty, just quieter, like the hum you notice only after a machine shuts off. By the time spring rolled around in Sioux City, the river thawed and the streets filled back up with people who'd spent too long indoors. Evan started Little League again. Same dusty field by the middle school. Same aluminum bleachers. I sat there most evenings with a folding chair and a thermos watching him jog out to right field with a confidence I hadn't seen before. He still glanced toward the fence sometimes, still checked to see who was watching. But he smiled more. Linda and I took things slow. We had to. Trust doesn't snap back like a rubber band, it rebuilds like a fence one post at a time. We talked more. About what we'd missed. About what we'd ignored because it was easier than facing it. About how peace isn't peace if a child pays for it. Rick faded into the background of our lives. No dramatic last confrontation, no cinematic downfall. Just distance. I heard through the same quiet channels you hear everything in a Midwestern town that he was still living with his mother, that he'd taken a job an hour away, that Tracy had filed for divorce. None of it came with satisfaction. Just a sober understanding that choices add up whether you're ready for the bill or not. One afternoon, a letter arrived with Rick's handwriting on the envelope. Linda handed it to me without comment. It was short, careful, half apology, half justification. He wrote about stress, about how his own father had been harder, about how he never meant for things to go this far. I folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in a drawer. Some things don't need a response. A few weeks later, I stood in line at the VFW fish fry paper plate in hand, listening to old men argue about whether the batter was better last year. The smell of fried cod and coffee hung in the air. Someone laughed too loud. Someone always does. I realized then how ordinary my life felt again, and how close I'd come to losing that. Rick had used the word respect like it meant fear, like it meant obedience, like it was something you could beat into a kid and call it love. But standing there listening to Evan laugh with a couple of boys from his team, I understood what respect really was. Respect is listening when a child whispers instead of waiting until they scream. Respect is staying calm when anger would be easier. Respect is choosing discomfort now so someone smaller doesn't carry it for the rest of their life. I didn't win anything. I protected something. If you're listening to this and you've ever wondered whether you should speak up, whether it's worth the tension, the cost, the sleepless nights, hear me when I say this. Silence is how they win. If this story made you stop and think, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you want to hear more true stories about ordinary people choosing to do the right thing, when it's hard, I hope you'll stick around and subscribe. Sometimes respect begins with one quiet decision.